Learn to live without my money. The words came like a slap, sharp and final. I watched as Callan pressed the scissors closed, slicing through the plastic with a satisfaction I had never seen on his face before. My credit card, my lifeline to groceries, to small comforts, to the little pieces of independence I still held, lay shredded on the table. The pieces scattered onto the hardwood floor, and for a moment, silence filled the room. I bent down slowly, my knees stiff with age, and picked them up one by one. I didn't argue, I didn't shout. I only said, "You're right." Callan smirked, tilting his head as though he'd won something. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, confident that he had reminded me of my place. I looked at him, at the expensive watch on his wrist, the crisp shirt. I knew he hadn't ironed himself, and I felt something inside me harden. This was my son, the boy I once carried to the library every Saturday, who used to hold my hand when storms frightened him. Now he looked at me as though I were another bill to pay. I slipped the shredded pieces into my pocket, holding them like evidence. My heart stung, not just from the humiliation, but from the realization that my own child saw me as a burden. Years of sacrifice, double shifts, skipped meals, secondhand clothes so he could have new, swept through my mind. And this house, the one he claimed I was just staying in, was also bought with the money I had gotten from selling my own home. And yet here I was, treated as though I had contributed nothing. "You're right," I whispered again. But this time, the words tasted different. Not surrender, but resolve. Because I knew the truth he had forgotten. I had built this life piece by piece, and I still held more power than he ever imagined. And soon, he would learn exactly how much. After Callan slammed the door that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the pieces of my card still pressed into my palm. My mind drifted backward, years folding over themselves like pages I had read too many times. I was only 30 when his father died. A sudden stroke, no warning, no time to prepare. One day, I was a wife, and the next, I was a widow with a 6-year-old boy staring at me, asking questions I couldn't answer. There was no choice but to keep going. I took every extra shift I could at the library, cataloging until my eyes blurred. On weekends, I tutored high school kids in English composition, scraping together just enough to cover Callan's growing needs. I learned how to stretch $1 until it nearly tore. Dinner was rice and beans more nights than I care to remember. Vacations were stories in books, not trips we could afford. I sold the little diamond pendant my mother left me to pay for his braces. Later, when college loomed, I sold the car I had loved, an old sedan that barely ran, but it was mine. Callan needed tuition more than I needed wheels. I walked to work in the rain, carrying an umbrella that bent in the wind, reminding myself it was worth it. Every sacrifice, every ache, every blister on my heels was for him. And Callan thrived. He never saw the worry lines etched into my face as I balanced bills late at night. He only saw the packed lunches, the clean clothes, the textbooks waiting on his desk. He grew up believing success was something he earned alone. But the truth was different. His victories had been paid for with my sleepless nights, with jewelry boxes emptied and bank accounts drained. Now, as I sat in his house decades later, treated like a dependent, I wondered how invisible those years had become to him. The weight of sacrifice still pressed against my chest, heavier than ever, and I knew I could no longer carry it in silence. It was time for him to see the cost he had forgotten. Callan liked to play the part of the devoted son. At family gatherings, he would stand tall, his arm casually draped around my shoulder, and announce, "I take care of Mom. She'd be lost without me." The words would draw nods of admiration, a few murmurs about what a good man he was, and I would smile politely, swallowing the truth that burned at the back of my throat. Behind closed doors, the script changed. He rifled through my grocery receipts, circling items he deemed unnecessary: a jar of honey, a bag of coffee beans, a small bouquet I'd picked up because the kitchen felt less lonely with color on the table. "You're lucky I don't cut you off for this nonsense," he'd mutter, waving the slips of paper like evidence in a trial. Even though I paid for everything with my own money, he told me I should be grateful. Grateful for the roof, for the utilities, for the scraps of dignity he allowed me. Yet, when his own credit card statements arrived, I saw the charges, numbers from upscale bars, new gadgets delivered to the doorstep, shoes that cost more than my monthly groceries. He never questioned his indulgences, only mine. I bit my tongue, storing away the indignities, watching the arrogance grow in him like a shadow that swallowed every corner of kindness I remembered. He had convinced himself that he was the provider, the savior, the one who carried me. In reality, he was blind to the truth. The life he flaunted was built on sacrifices he never acknowledged. Each time I stayed silent, I wondered if I was teaching him that this treatment was acceptable. My silence became a shield, but also a prison. And as his boasts grew louder, so did the ache inside me. I began to see clearly that arrogance wasn't just clouding his judgment. It had already stolen his respect. And if I continued saying nothing, it would strip me of mine as well. That night, as he showed off a brand new watch bought without hesitation, I realized the time had come to guard my own worth before he spent that too. Callan never asked about my money because he assumed there was nothing to ask. In his mind, I was a retired teacher living on scraps, dependent on his generosity. He had no idea that after retirement, while he was busy showing off his promotions, I had been quietly building something of my own. It started small, an account I opened at a different bank, one he didn't know about. Each month I tucked away part of my pension, sometimes only a few hundred, sometimes more. I refused to let him see the statements. He thought I spent every cent on groceries and church donations, and I let him believe it. But I didn't just save, I learned. I read about bonds, mutual funds, and high-yield accounts. At night, when the house was quiet, I studied interest tables and return projections the way I used to grade essays. Slowly, the numbers grew. What began as a cautious safety net became something far greater. Now spread across accounts, my savings stood at over $240,000. Modest compared to fortunes in magazines, but for me, it meant freedom. It meant I would never truly need Callan. It meant the choice to walk away was always mine, even if he hadn't realized it yet. And then there was the cottage, a weathered little house by the edge of town, paid for in full years ago, standing in my name alone. I'd kept it quiet, fixing it up bit by bit with money Callan thought had vanished into bills. He never knew it existed because he never imagined I could hold on to anything without him. Every receipt, every bank statement, every deed was tucked into neat folders in the locked drawer of my desk. I kept them like a teacher keeps lesson plans, organized, thorough, ready to prove a point when the time came, and I knew that moment was coming. It was supposed to be something small, a simple dress for the church fundraiser. I hadn't bought anything new in years, and when I found it on clearance, I thought it was a harmless indulgence. But when Callan found the receipt on the counter, he held it up like a verdict. $180? Are you out of your mind, Mom? His voice carried through the house, sharp and full of contempt. This is irresponsible. You can't just throw money away like this. I stood still, watching him wave the slip of paper. Callan, it's not some luxury. It's for one evening, a special event. And besides, do you remember that golf trip you took last month that cost $3,000 to... That's different, he snapped. Golf is networking. It's for my career. Your dress is nothing but vanity. I felt the words sink in like stones, heavy and unfair. For decades I had gone without so he could have everything, sports, college, trips abroad. And now, when I finally allowed myself one modest purchase, he dared to call me wasteful. The hypocrisy was unbearable. I could hear the echo of my own footsteps on rainy sidewalks, carrying groceries after selling my car. I could see the hollow box where my jewelry had once been, traded for his tuition. Every sacrifice came back to me in that moment, sharper than his voice. Without another word, Callan marched to his desk, grabbed the scissors, and returned. I knew what was coming, but I didn't move. He held my debit card in the air like a trophy and sliced it in half, the plastic cracking under the blades. The pieces fluttered to the floor. There, he said with finality. No more reckless spending. Learn to live without my money. I bent down, picked up the shards, and straightened. But I didn't cry. Something inside me shifted instead. My patience, stretched thin for too long, hardened into resolve. Because if Callan thought this was the end of my independence, he had no idea what storm was already building in silence. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the stairs, as Callan moved toward his bedroom. By the time his door clicked shut, I was already sitting at my small desk in the suite he'd assigned me. The pieces of my cut card lay out like fragments of a broken promise. I stared at them for a long time, then reached for the phone. The first call was to the bank. My voice didn't tremble as I confirmed my identity and asked the representative to close the joint account. I requested half the balance, my rightful share, transferred to an account in my name only. The second call was to an old friend, Evelyn, a lawyer who had once sat beside me on library boards and later helped me draft my will. She answered groggy but warm, and when I explained what had happened, her tone sharpened. "Send me the documents tomorrow. Property deeds, retirement accounts, anything you want secured. We'll make sure it's all airtight." After we hung up, I pulled open the locked drawer where I'd kept everything organized. Folders labeled, receipts clipped neatly, deeds tucked into protective sleeves. Years of quiet diligence spread before me like an arsenal. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, the kind that fills the air with both comfort and resolve. Sitting at the small table by the window, I sipped slowly, letting the heat steady me. I didn't feel fear anymore, only clarity. Callan thought cutting up a card would cage me. What he didn't realize was that he had freed me instead. He had forced me to claim what had always been mine. By the time the clock struck midnight, the bank transfer was complete. My lawyer was on alert, and my next steps were already forming. Upstairs, Callan slept soundly, unaware that his house of cards was beginning to tilt. By the next afternoon, I knew the silence wouldn't last. Callan left the house with his usual swagger, keys jangling, phone in hand. I stayed behind, folding laundry at the table, waiting for the storm I knew was coming. Later, I learned exactly how it unfolded. He had gone into a deli near his office, ordered a sandwich and coffee, and swiped his card with that careless confidence he always carried. Declined. The cashier asked him to try again. He laughed it off, sliding the card once more. Declined. This time the line behind him grew restless. Someone sighed. Another whispered. The cashier's brow furrowed as she repeated the word like a gavel falling. Declined. Callan's face burned red. He fumbled for another card, muttering something about the machine being faulty, but the damage was done. Eyes were on him, watching the man who bragged about financial control suddenly falter. He stormed out, leaving the sandwich untouched. Out in the parking lot, he called the bank. His voice, usually dripping with authority, carried panic. "Now this is Callan Rowan. My card's not working. What's going on?" The representative checked the account. "Sir, your joint account was closed this morning at 9:30 by the co-holder, Mrs. Lisa Rowan. Funds were transferred accordingly." There was a pause long enough for me to imagine his breath catching. "She can't do that," he stammered. "Yes, sir. In joint accounts, either party has equal authority to close or withdraw. The balance was split, and your portion remains accessible in your personal account." The words hit him harder than the whispers in that deli line. The money he thought was solely his had never been just his. It was ours, and now it was divided. Oh, it? He hung up and drove home, pale and tight-jawed. I heard the front door slam, the heavy thud of his shoes across the floor, and when he called my name, his voice carried not triumph, but the raw edge of disbelief. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame, and Callan's voice followed, sharp and frantic. "Mom, what did you do?" I didn't look up right away. I kept folding the towel in my hands, smoothing the edges until they lined neatly before placing it on the stack. Only then did I meet his eyes. "I did exactly what you told me to do," I said evenly. "I learned to live without your money." His face was flushed, his chest heaving. "You closed the account. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I withdrew my half," I replied. 87,000, nothing more." The color drained from his cheeks. He hadn't expected me to know the exact figure. His mouth opened, but no words came. "I've watched you for years, Callan, pretending you carry me while spending freely on yourself." He tried to speak, but his throat worked uselessly, the fight slipping out of him. The man who had mocked me as dependent now stood cornered by his own lies. "And one more thing," I added, letting my voice harden. "You've assumed all this time that I don't understand money, but I've been saving too. Over $200,000 spread across accounts and investments. Independent of you, independent of anyone." The room went quiet, except for the hum of the dryer. Callan's eyes darted from my face to the folded towels, as if the truth itself was too heavy to hold. He sank into a chair. No arrogance left, just shock. I placed the last towel on the pile and wiped my hands clean. The silence between us carried more weight than any argument ever could, and I knew the balance in this house had shifted for good. Callan sat hunched at the kitchen table, his hands gripping the edge as if it might keep him steady. I set the folded towels aside and pulled out a chair across from him. For once, he didn't try to fill the silence with his usual bravado. He just stared at me, waiting for me to soften, to retreat the way I always had. But I didn't. "This ends now," I said quietly. "From this day forward, I am not your dependent. I am your equal." His jaw tightened. "Mom, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I cut in. "I understand that you built a story where you were the provider and I was the burden. But that story isn't true. I won't let you use it anymore." The words seemed to hollow him out. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the table. "Fine, we'll do it your way." But I heard the difference in his tone. This wasn't respect. This was fear. The fear of being exposed to others, of losing the image he had built. He wasn't agreeing because he believed in me. He was agreeing because he had no choice. I let the silence stretch. I didn't argue. Didn't demand more than his reluctant promise. I had no interest in convincing him to value me. I only needed to secure my position and protect what was mine. "Good," I said finally. "Then that's settled." He nodded again, though his shoulders sagged with resentment he couldn't quite hide. I gathered my papers from the desk drawer and slipped them into my bag. He didn't ask where I was going, and I didn't offer an explanation. Because while Callan thought the matter was closed, I was already preparing for the next step, one that would free me from ever needing his permission again. 3 days later, I packed my things into 2 neat suitcases and left Callan's house without ceremony. He didn't follow me to the door, and I didn't ask for help carrying my bags. By noon, I was unlocking the front door of my cottage, a place that had been mine for years, though I had kept it quiet. The deed bore only my name, proof that some parts of my life had always belonged solely to me. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the paneling, a scent that reminded me of the years I spent quietly refurbishing the place. It wasn't grand, but it was whole, and it was mine. I set down my suitcases, ran a hand over the worn banister, and felt something I hadn't in a long time: freedom without apology. That afternoon, I visited the bank to open new accounts. This time, there would be no joint signatures, no strings for Callan to pull. I listed my niece as beneficiary, a young woman who had checked in on me more in a year than my son had in 5. It felt right. Callan came by once a few days later. He stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He didn't argue, didn't scold, didn't lecture. He only asked how I was settling in, then left quickly, as though the weight of my independence was heavier than he could bear. When he was gone, I brewed a pot of coffee and carried a mug out to the porch. I sat with the newspaper spread across my lap, the sun dipping low beyond the trees. The quiet around me wasn't loneliness, it was peace. Independence had never been stolen from me. It had always been there, waiting, tucked beneath years of sacrifice and silence. Now it was in full view. I thought of Callan's words, the ones he had flung at me with such certainty. "Learn to live without my money." I smiled into my coffee.